Today we're just going to do a quick run through of what trauma-informed care is. At this point in time in society, everybody should have a basic concept of what it is, and we really should be using it in everyday life because trauma impacts everybody, whether it's a direct victim or a secondary victim. If you're doing life with somebody, chances are that they've experienced some kind of trauma. And so today is just a little bit about that. We always like to put this disclaimer out there, because we do talk about sometimes some of our cases, which are sexual assaults in nature or sex trafficking. We reference those minimally, but we do want people to take care of themselves. That is being trauma informed. So if you need a minute, please take care of yourself. So some quick learning objectives is we just really want to try to identify like what is trauma-informed care and why is it important to our community, not only in your work, but in your personal life and in our West Texas area. We want to recognize like how it impacts us not only physically, but emotionally and our behaviors and interactions with services and other people. We want to identify these key principles of having trauma-informed care in practice, including safety, trust, collaboration, and empowerment. We want to recognize these trauma responses and individuals that may be seeking services and what that looks like in them, all right? And then how we respond to that. We want to apply at least 2 practical strategies for engaging individuals with compassion, respect, and sensitivity. We want to put the human aspect to people. And then lastly, we want to identify ways to reduce re-traumatization and improve service experiences for individuals and families. And then it's not on there, but we also want you to learn how to take care of yourself while you're doing this, whether you're doing it in work or you have a family member that's experiencing trauma, because your well-being is super important. And if you don't take care of yourself, it's hard for us to take care of others, okay? So I'll turn it over to Izzy.
All right, so first of all, we have to understand what trauma is. And so this is the definition given to us directly from the American Psychological Association. So any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behaviors, and other aspects of functioning. But we're going to break this down a little bit more. Mary, if you could go to the next slide for me.
And I always like to just kind of throw it in. Has anybody in here ever experienced a car wreck, a fender bender, something like that? That's a traumatic, right? I flew my car off the road in black ice in early Texas about 14 years ago. So when we do get any kind of weather in Lubbock besides wind, everybody knows I'm working from home. I don't get behind the car. So even simple things like that can greatly affect us in trauma ways.
Yes, so like I said, we're going to break this down into big T traumas and little t traumas. So big T traumas are going to be those life-threatening events or situations. So just like Mary was saying, getting into a car accident, maybe going to war, things like that where we really don't know if we're going to survive or make it out of those events. Those are going to be big T traumas. Little t traumas, I think, are less known, but they're just as significant. And these are events that just create significant distress. So it could be losing a job, maybe death of a pet or a loved one, experiencing a divorce. It could even be if we're experiencing emotional abuse or verbal abuse. These events, we know we're not going to die from them, but they still change the way that we view the world. And what research has shown us is when people have built up or multiple and chronic little t traumas, it can be more difficult to work with them or to kind of untangle some of these thoughts or their perceptions about the world because of how frequently they've experienced those things.
We forgot to mention this, but if you have a question, please just stop us and ask. We want you to ask questions. We want you to leave feeling like you had those answers.
So now we're going to break down all the different ways that trauma impacts us in our body or mind. So the first one we'll talk about is emotional impacts. It can cause emotional dysregulation. So maybe you're interacting with someone and they get very angry very quickly and you're like, whoa, that was just a small event. Like they didn't have eggs at the store and you're about to punch somebody. What is that about? Because they can't regulate their emotions. They can experience anxiety, sadness, or shame, and then they can also experience numbing. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation, but this is where we're going to just detach from our thoughts, behaviors, and memories. And that can make it difficult to assess how severe trauma actually was, because when we numb ourselves from it or dissociate, then we don't see the trauma clearly. We don't see it start to finish. It's like fragmented. And so because of that, we only remember, oh, well, you know, I was taken at this point, but I don't remember the actual assault that occurred to me. And so maybe it wasn't that bad, or maybe it was my fault, and we start to distort our thinking about how that event played out.
And in practice, a couple of weeks ago, I went to go testify at a federal hearing in San Angelo on behalf of a victim who is now 14. Oh, she was 14 when she was sex trafficked, but she's now 18. And when we were in court, when we first entered the courthouse, you know how you have to put like your belongings down and it runs through security? The security guard flagged her bag and she had a pair of tweezers in there. She was doing her makeup. And when he told her that she needed to probably take them out, she had a meltdown. Like, she was ready to check out, she was ready to leave. And that's kind of what like emotional dysregulation looks like. She's got a lot of trauma. And recognizing that, we were able to just kind of step back, let her take some breaths, let her realize like, hey, he's not gonna take him, let's just get through there and then we'll go up to the room. And then she was okay. So in practice, that might be what it looks like, okay?
So now we'll move on to the physical impacts, and this is where I like to get a little bit nerdy because I just like learning about the brain. But starting with somatization, this is going to be how our body stores some of that trauma. And some examples of this could be someone who has gastrointestinal issues, cardiovascular changes, or musculoskeletal impacts. And you might be thinking like, well, how does this relate? But if we think about this in practice, someone who is worried that they're not going to make it out of a situation, how is their body reacting? Their heart rate's up, they can't breathe, their stomach is in knots from anxiety, and that can lead to long-lasting impacts. We call these ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, which a lot of research has been done about on how those lead to these chronic illnesses like the cardiovascular changes and gastrointestinal issues. So it's really interesting, and this is why it's important for survivors to go and get their body checked so we can see how to treat them and stabilize them a little bit more. Moving on to how trauma changes our cortisol levels. Again, our stress is up, especially if we're talking about someone who's experienced multiple little t traumas. If you think about a child who every single day they were in an abusive situation with their parents, they're constantly thinking, how is mom or dad going to act today? Are they going to be nice? Are they going to hurt me? Are they going to name call me? So they're constantly stressed. And then, so we look at how this impacts the brain. There's really three main component parts that are impacted by trauma in our brain. The first one is our prefrontal cortex, and this is the part of the brain that's in charge of all the rational decision making. So when we're faced with a decision, our prefrontal cortex kicks in and it says, okay, let's think of the consequences of this decision or the benefits of making this decision, and we can weigh them out and make that best decision for ourselves. But someone who's experienced chronic trauma, that part of their brain is going to be very underdeveloped. And the reason for that is because when we're in a life-threatening situation, our amygdala is going to be making all the decisions for us. And the amygdala is what our trauma responses are, so that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And when this is constantly making decisions, it's not thinking about consequences or what the good things are going to be, it's just survive this situation. So we're gonna fight, we're gonna fly, freeze, or fawn. And so the way that we like to visualize this is using this hand signal. So this is our prefrontal cortex, and our thumb is the amygdala. And whenever we have a threat, the prefrontal cortex turns off and our amygdala does all the work. So if this is constantly turned off, that's why it's going to be underdeveloped. And this is starting to make all decisions for us. So then, as we were explaining, we're faced with something that seems like a small situation where maybe someone who hasn't experienced trauma, their prefrontal cortex will kick in. Someone who has a lot of trauma, their amygdala is going to be making decisions. And so we're going to have big reactions to small things.
How many of y'all worked like maybe offering resources to a client or putting them in connection with like medical care or just some kind of resource in the community because they've experienced some kind of distress or they're needing like some kind of assistance? And you might work really hard because you're all amazing workers and you present them these amazing resources and options, and sometimes they don't choose to use them. And initially we can respond in an untrauma-informed way by saying, I did all this work and you don't even want to use these options, right? But when we take into consideration in a trauma-informed way, we realize, like Izzy was saying, that amygdala, that decision-making part of their brain, it's not thinking in the way of long-term, how is this going to benefit me? So sometimes we have to recognize that trauma has impacted that decision-making. And so even though we see if you just follow this plan, it's going to turn out good, they might not see it that way. And it's easy to get frustrated, but we have to remember they have to choose this correctly, okay?
And it takes time for them to start learning how to use their prefrontal cortex. It takes a lot of time and requires a lot of patience. And so that's why we felt this training was so important, because it's easy to get frustrated with our clients when they have big reactions to what to us seem like small things. But again, we want to meet them where they're at and help them on their path to healing. So we'll break down the 4 F's of trauma. So like you guys have this handout in front of you. The first one, fight. And so it tells you the common experiences, behaviors, and some recovery strategies for each trauma response. So again, fight, they're gonna have tense muscles, increased heart rate, increased body temperature, and that's going to come out as rage outbursts, seeming intimidating, maybe criticizing, or feeling controlling. And then what we can do to help them is maybe offer some forgiveness, go through some healthy communication strategies with them, encourage them to do some physical movement, so that way they release some of that stress from their body. And then the same is done again for flight, for freeze, and then fawn. And fawn, I think, is a little bit less known trauma response, but this is kind of when a survivor goes along with the situation because they know if they fight or if they try to run or if they freeze, there could be alternative consequences, like this person's going to hurt me. And so when the trauma is occurring, just get it over with and then I'll be safe afterwards. And so then in turn, long term, that looks like a lot of shame, because why didn't I fight back, or why didn't I do something differently? It leads to depression, feeling disappointed in themselves. And then that comes out as they're people pleasers. They can't say no. They are overcaring, very empathetic. It leads them to feeling at risk of exploitation, a lot of codependence as well. I think this one is a really difficult trauma response to work with clients when this is the one that always comes out. And it's also important to remember these things are automatic. A survivor does not decide, I'm going to fight this time, I'm going to fawn this time. It's just whatever their instinct is in that moment. Because I think a lot of times we hear about crimes or things that happen and we're like, well, I would have done this if I was in that situation. But in reality, we don't know what we would do.
And if we think about it, we all have these trauma responses, and we probably have already used them several times, right? And so when we're working with people in the community, a lot of times you don't get to know all of their history. You don't get to come in with a set of report that tells you like what they've been through. So meeting them where they're at, understanding that you yourself has maybe exhibited some of these trauma responses, you're just able to recognize, hey, maybe they're acting this way and responding this way because they've been through some things. Because I know I have, right?
And then we'll go into some of the cognitive impacts. So it leads to changes in their thought process. So they start to think that the world is bad, or that I'm bad, I'm worthless. We call those core beliefs. And so a lot of the healing part or the processing of trauma is working to undo some of those cognitive distortions. It can lead to hallucinations or delusions, and so that could look like hearing things. A lot of our clients report hearing kind of some ringing or maybe voices or crowds playing in their heads. Delusions, again, are just thinking, it could be the world is out to get me, someone's following me, feeling very paranoid. It can lead to feeling different. No one's gonna understand my experience. I'm, different than anybody else. I'm damaged. They'll experience triggers and flashbacks. So a trigger is just any sensory point that causes us to go and relive the traumatic event. So that looks like sight, touch, sound, smell, or taste. And a survivor doesn't always know what their triggers are until they experience them, and then they have more awareness about themselves. And so that's why we have to be very patient with survivors when we're working with them. So then when they experience a trigger, again, it sends them into a flashback, and then they feel like they're reliving the trauma all over again. And then lastly, dissociation, depersonalization, and derealization. So dissociation happens whenever our mind kind of turns off and we go to a different place because we're trying to keep ourselves safe. So how many of you guys have ever been driving home and you get home and you're like, how do I make it here? Were the lights green?
Don't remember
I
the
hope
path.
so.
Yeah. Did I actually stop at the stop
Yeah,
sign?
exactly.
Like, yeah.
I know I've experienced that. But that's a very mild form of dissociation. The more extreme or severe forms are going to be dissociative identity disorder, where someone has multiple personalities. But again, this is the brain's way of protecting itself. It's saying, you can't, or we don't want you to fully experience this traumatic event, so let's go somewhere else. Let's daydream, turn off, and then whenever we're safe again, we'll come back. But then that leads into some of the depersonalization. So again, leaving our body, feeling like we're kind of hovering above ourselves and just watching the world occur, or derealization, where we feel like nothing is real and we're just kind of going through the motions a little bit.
And again, if you're not used to trauma to this extreme, if you're working with somebody, or if you even have a family member that's describing this to you, sometimes it's hard to know what to say, right? Or to even know how to get them out of it. I had a client one time who was about to go take a final at South Plains College, and she called me when she got there, and she said, Miss Mary, I'm in one of the classrooms, but I don't know how I got here. I don't know where I'm supposed to go to take my test. Like, I'm just kind of like trying to figure out, like, I don't remember the trip here, right? And so I had to kind of help her ground herself and realize, like, hey, describe to me where you're at. Let's get you back to somewhere safe. And then she had to reschedule that exam because she went into some deep dissociation on the trip even up to the college, okay? So when you're receiving these kind of intakes or just these stories or these descriptions that people are telling you, a lot of times it's not always that you have to tell him, hey, this is what's happening, you're dissociating. Just meet them where they're at, make sure they're safe, help them with some kind of grounding tool, okay?
Mm-hmm. And that can really look like when you're talking to somebody and they're just very flat and you're almost like, are they hearing what I'm saying? Yeah. Or they even could be telling you their trauma and it's very matter of fact, like there's no emotions related to it, and that's them experiencing dissociation.
Yeah. I didn't get to ask at the beginning, but is everybody here from the health department? Is there anybody from an outside agency? What agencies are y'all from? Star Care.
Okay.
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 And Star Care, and then
cool.
Department of State Health Services.
Okay, very nice. Well, thank
Awesome.
y'all all for joining
Yes.
us. So I'd just like to know the crowd, because again, this impacts everybody. I know we say survivor a lot, but even the people you're working with, they've survived something. That's why they're in services with you. All right. So please don't just limit that to survivors of sexual violence. In life, we survive a lot. Okay. So apply it to where you're at in your family or career or friend group.
And we'll go into behavioral next. And so we can see this through survivors trying to reenact the events. And this is really just to try and take control of the situation. Like, let me put myself in the same situation and prove to myself that I can make it through, or that I'm going to fight back this time. And so that could look like hypersexuality, someone who is looking to have sex with other people. Especially we see that with our sexual assault victims because they want to prove I'm in control. It could be driving recklessly or getting involved in repetitive destructive relationships. And then next, it can look like self-harm or self-destructive behaviors. And this is really just them trying to cope with their traumatic events. So when people self-harm, it could look like cutting, burning, banging their head, pulling their hair. We did this presentation at the jail, and even they were mentioning someone who's working out a lot in the courtyard, trying to just make themselves look a certain way or not feel all the feelings. It could also look like binge eating or not eating at all, fighting, or just really having impulsive behaviors. And then we see a lot of substance use as well. Again, just trying to cope with what they've experienced because they don't know how else to. And so maybe their emotions whenever they're not using, or that anxiety or the depression, and what they learn is, when I use this substance, I don't feel those things and I feel a lot better. And so then they get used to that and they start doing it regularly. And then lastly, avoidance. So I'm just not going to go to that place where I got hurt, or I'm not going to interact with the people that I got hurt when I was with. And so we see a lot of isolating behaviors too. And then lastly, we have the social and interpersonal. So like I just mentioned, we see survivors isolate from their friends and family because they feel like, again, they're not going to understand what I went through, or I don't want to be a burden to them. They've got their own things going on, so I don't want to put my stress onto them too. They'll also have difficulty trusting others, especially if they were hurt or put into a situation by people that they did trust. Now we feel like the world is not a safe place to be in. Maybe they have no support system or they don't have a positive support system. We always like to differentiate between those two, right? Because we can have a support system, that doesn't mean that they're positive. They can be encouraging you to do unhealthy coping habits. So we want them to have a positive support system.
It's even recognizing that sometimes we're really quick to say like, oh, well, reach out to your family. Sometimes family is who's abusing them or causing the trauma. So that's not always a good option. So being trauma-informed care, trauma-informed even means recognizing like family might not be a good option for them, right?
And then lastly, attachment struggle. So maybe we see somebody who, again, doesn't want any relationships at all and they're going to be on their own. And then on the flip side, we see people who are in a lot of relationships. And maybe we on the outside can say like, why are you in this relationship? Like, this is not a healthy thing to be in. They're name calling, they're hitting you, they're abusing you, but they want to be loved and they want to prove to themselves that they are lovable. So there's a lot of education that goes into working with survivors.
Especially if you're a caseworker, they might come in and tell you, hey, I'm dating this person, but then next week they're dating somebody else and you're like, wait a minute, I thought you were dating this person, right? It can just get very confusing for them because they just don't want to be alone. And because of the trauma, sometimes they will tell me something is better than nothing, right? That's one of our basic needs. So it's just understanding that impact.
All right, so now we're going to talk about the stages of change. And I think this is so important for anybody to know about, whether you're working with trauma survivors or just any individual in general. So the stages of change is normally used when we're talking about addiction work, seeing people who get clean and then they relapse and we're like, why can they not just stay clean? And this is why. So we have these different stages. The first one is pre-contemplation, and this is where someone says, I don't have an issue, right? Don't need to change, just gonna stay the course of what I'm doing. And then they'll move into contemplation, and this is where they're like, okay, I think something's going on, maybe I should change something, but I'm not gonna actually do anything about it quite yet. Then they'll move into preparation. So we're looking at resources, we're ready to start changing, and then we'll go into action where we're going to counseling, we're going to meetings, we're doing the healthy things that we know we should be doing. And maintenance is just continuing on doing all those healthy behaviors. And sometimes our clients experience relapse where again, they'll go into old patterns that's familiar or that's more comfortable. And the reason that we want this to be so emphasized to you guys is working with trauma survivors can be really frustrating. Sometimes it's hard work, but when we understand this, sometimes we can take the fault off of ourselves or not feel like, what could I have done better? What could I have done differently? Don't get me wrong, those are still good evaluation questions to ask ourselves, but when we can look at this and say, that client, they were just in pre-contemplation, they weren't ready to change, I could have done the world for them and they still wouldn't have done anything with it.
And this helps to protect your well-being too, because I know everybody here is an amazing employee and you're doing above and beyond to help your clients, but again, you might leave walking away feeling like, what else could I have done, right? And it feels yucky to feel like that, but it's got to be their choice, right? Yes, ma'am.
I just also wanted to add that the stages of change is not linear.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
And they're like, they go to the action stage and they kind of regress back.
Yes.
Absolutely. At our agency, we don't close anybody out. We let them work services as long as they need to. And I think that's pretty amazing for us to be able to do, because it's oftentimes that we get them, they get stabilized, they get clean if that's an issue, and then they're doing well on their own. Like that's the goal, right? Kind of like with housing. You might help them for a little bit. You want them to eventually be able to maintain their own housing. And then we might have something that sets them back. It could be relapse. It could be a new assault situation, whatever the case might be. And then again, it's meeting them there. We don't say, well, you already maxed out your services, so sorry for you, I did all I could, right? This is very important, and that's very, very true. Thank you for sharing that.
And I'm sure all of us mental health professionals in the room have heard, meet them where they're at, and you're like, I feel like I am, but this is where that foundation is coming from. Meet them if they're in pre-contemplation, and just set that expectation for yourself that, okay, maybe they're not ready to do all the action yet, but they're gonna remember our conversation. They're gonna remember the resources I gave them, the way that I talked to them non-judgmentally. So when they are in contemplation or preparation, they're going to come back to you and they're going to be excited to do that change.
And if you were a very good trauma-informed care worker that showed them that care, they're going to come back to you. They're going to remember you, and they're going to really thank you that you actually treated them like a human. And you just listen. Sometimes they just need you to listen. They don't always need a solution. That's very important too.
And so now let's get into trauma-informed care. We've been talking about trauma for the past 40 minutes, but what about the trauma-informed care aspect? So according to the Trauma-Informed Care Implementation Resource Center, trauma-informed care is the shift from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So we want to understand how trauma is impacting the person, understand how we can help them recover, help recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, maybe in our patients, families, but also our staff, like our coworkers too. We want to integrate these knowledge about trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices and actively avoid re-traumatization. And I'm going to use our agency to explain re-traumatization because I feel like it's the easiest way to explain it. So when we have a survivor who's been sexually assaulted, they go to the hospital and they have to explain to the sexual assault nurse examiner what they experienced. And then an advocate comes and they might have to tell them too. Then the police officer comes and they have to tell it again. And then if they decide to report, okay, now we have to go to a follow-up interview, tell the story again. If it goes to trial, okay, I've got to tell it again. And each time they're telling that story, they are reliving the trauma and experiencing re-traumatization. And so when we can integrate better policies and practices into our agencies and avoid re-traumatization, a victim is going to be more likely to come back and feel safe. So here are the core principles of trauma-informed care. First and foremost, safety. We want them to feel not only physically safe, but psychologically safe as well. So listening non-judgmentally, seeing when they come in, do you need a water? Have you eaten today? Have you slept? Asking them these questions that really do humanize them again. Building trust and transparency. Never make promises to a client that you can't follow through with. We want to be honest with them, like, housing is such a big issue here. We don't want to be like, I'm going to get you a house tomorrow. And then when you don't, they're going to be feeling betrayed again and they're not going to want to come back. So being really honest with them, even though that can be difficult, like, hey, we just don't have a lot of options here, but here's what we do have, and make a plan that way. Do some peer support, like get with that individual and see other people who have maybe similar experiences so they can relate to them and normalize what they're experiencing. Collaborate, 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 work with the community, work with who you can, work smarter, not harder, right?
Like what we're doing today.
Yes.
Exchange numbers and let's call each other. Definitely.
Even though we would like to be the experts on everything, we have to be realistic. We're just not. And so lean on those people who are experts in the areas that you need them to be experts in.
And when it comes to collaboration, no one agency can do it alone. I've yet to find one, because maybe you can offer something that we can't, and we can offer something that you can't, and we all work together in our community. Lubbock has some amazing resources, and it's about getting them connected with those.
And I think the best thing you can do whenever you are collaborating with other people is, if you are the first person to meet the victim, then hey, let me go with you to meet this next person and do that warm handoff. That's building trust, and you're showing the victim too, like, I trust this person, we can trust this person, let's go meet them, rather than saying, call this person, you're on your own.
Yeah.
Because they're more likely to follow through when they have somebody there just to help support them through the process. Next, empowerment. So looking at what the victim's strengths are, they're gonna have some strengths even if they don't realize it themselves. We have to really point those things out to them, like, you are a survivor, I can't believe you made it through that, like, you are so strong, you're resilient, telling them all of those things and really just validate all of their feelings.
Yeah, a lot of times we hear people saying, well, we just want to help them find their voice. Well, they've always had a voice, but maybe trauma has shut it down. So it's just about empowering them that, hey, let's revive that. Let's let it get vocal again.
And then humility and responsiveness. So acknowledging what our own biases are or stereotypes. I mean, we're not perfect. We all have our own backgrounds and things. And so just being honest with ourselves, if we can't work with a survivor who's experienced something because we don't understand it, or we just come from a different space, then hand them off to somebody else who can care for them appropriately.
Yeah, so when we're doing like our human trafficking training, I always like to share, when it comes to like that and our biases and stereotypes, as a society, like let's just be honest, a lot of times when we think about survivors like of anything, of any kind of abuse, we think, why don't they just leave if it's that bad? Especially for our adults, right? Because they can consent. We say, well, if it's that bad, why don't they just leave? But what do statistics tell us, especially like about domestic violence survivors? How many times does it take for them to leave and come back before they stay away for good, or they're actually killed? Anybody know? Like 7 to 8 times. Right? And so we have to recognize that. So if you're working with somebody, hopefully our humility in response is like recognizing, hey, yeah, maybe they left this time, but when they come back and you hear that they went back, not being like, girl, what were you thinking? Rather than just saying, okay, like I'm just remember I'm here. And then they might leave again and then come back and you're there every single time.
And don't get me wrong, it's not horrible. We're human. We're going to feel that way.
Yeah.
Don't show it in front of the client. Go to your supervisor, go to a colleague, debrief, and then you can go back.
You come to our office and hang out. We'll have debrief with you. And we always have snacks and food.
Yes.
All the time.
All right, so what does this look like in practice? Of course, my mental health friends, we know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but we're going to start from the bottom, work our way up. So again, we want to make sure that their physiological needs are met first. Make sure they've got water, food, shelter, they've been sleeping, they have clothes, and then we'll go on to safety. Do they have a place to stay? Do they have a job? Their physical health needs, and then we can work our way up to love and belonging, self-esteem, and self-actualization. And then we can also use person-first language. So this is where we're going to put the person before their experience. So instead of saying addict, let's say a person who's experiencing substance use. Instead of homeless person, a person experiencing homelessness. Instead of inmate, a person experiencing incarceration. And we really want to avoid power and control. Normally people who are survivors of trauma have been controlled or overpowered in some way. And so what are some ways that we can promote safety, respect to the victim? Now we'll go into burnout and compassion fatigue. So burnout is where we have feelings of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, diminished self-confidence, and reduced personal accomplishments that gradually accumulate as a result of stress. And this doesn't just have to do with like trauma work or anything. This can just us be going through our day-to-day lives. When things start to feel very monotonous and it's like, here we go again, another day, we're going through the motions, right? That can be burnout too, especially if there are any students in the room. Then we also have compassion fatigue, and this is what we experience just from working with survivors or people who have experienced trauma, where we don't feel any empathy towards them anymore. We feel kind of cynical about the world. Maybe even our view of the world is like, it's dangerous, there's no hope, we're never gonna help anybody. Those are signs of compassion fatigue.
Absolutely, and everybody here sounds like you're working with people in the community, you're dealing with really hard cases. Does your life get to pause while you're dealing with them? No, all of us have our own situations at home, and we have to bring those with us sometimes and learn how to put the button to the side to where we're able to say, let me focus on this client. And that's really hard. So you have to be able to exhibit when you might be reaching burnout and compassion fatigue.
And so here are some signs to look out for that you may be experiencing compassion fatigue. So that emotional and physical exhaustion, like you could sleep all day and you still feel tired, feeling unsettled, maybe you're dissociating a little bit, you're feeling numb, withdrawn, you're stressed all the time, we feel helpless, a little bit irritable or angry, depressed, anxiety, fear. Again, changes in our beliefs about safety, trust, power and control, or esteem. Thinking that we're the only ones who can help and feeling that we're not okay until a victim is okay. You know, we can't pour from an empty cup. I'm sure you've all heard that. And so that's what Mary was saying too. And like, not one agency can do it all. Don't burn yourself out or experience compassion fatigue from working harder than the client is. Know what those boundaries are. And we don't want to blur boundaries. So here's some self-care that you guys can do. You have this handout in front of you as well. because self-care isn't just taking a bubble bath or having a glass of wine at the end of the day. You can definitely do those things, but let's
one
try
glass.
to, yes.
Just one glass.
Yes.
Not the whole bottle.
But let's try to expand our toolbox a little bit here. So physical, do some sort of body movement. I'm not saying go run a marathon. I wouldn't want to do that. I'm not going to ask you to do that unless that's your thing. But it could just be stretching. It could be walking, doing some yoga, anything like that. Emotional, know your own support system, who you can talk to. Maybe you need to talk to a therapist. Social, again, hang out with your friends, hang out with your family, your pets. Spiritual, if you are religious, if you're spiritual, connecting with that side. Personal, have some hobbies, do something to decompress after work, after working these hard cases. Space, you know, have a healthy space that you can go to where you feel safe, you feel comfortable, whether it's the park, maybe it's your home, maybe it's...
Sometimes it's just getting up and walking away from your desk and just walking down the hall or something, or to your coworker's office and bugging them.
Exactly. Financial, again, look at your own finances, budget appropriately, make sure that your needs are being met. And lastly, work, again, do time management. Don't work yourself to death. Know when you need to take some time off or just when you need a break.
Yeah. Maritza, what do you do for self-care?
I like to do the little mini balls. Like I put them together with the rest of their kids' toys, but they make me really happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Y'all see those little squishy things that the kids nowadays are using that are like $20, and I'm like, what is the big deal? But then I get one and I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I'll order one now. I ordered some that are butter sticks and they're just great squishies. So anything like that is great self-care for you as well. All right.
Absolutely. Here's some references, our contact information, questions that you guys might have.
That was like such a fast rundown.
It was. And the last time we did this presentation was 2 hours long.
Yeah, a little over 2 hours. So
we tried to shorten it.
Yeah. What questions y'all have? Y'all are more than welcome to screenshot that if y'all want us to email you the presentation.